Today I'm taking a look at the lowest possible entry points to gaming in 2026 in terms of GPU, and these cards are incredibly cheap. These are some of the cheapest cards that you can buy right now, and these are all going to be second hand, of course, because you're not going to find these new. But these cards are really the lowest possible way that you can play games in 2026, and going lower than this just doesn't make sense. And you're not going to be able to play the games that you want to play if you go lower than this, unless you're just playing something like Counter-Strike. But these cards are interesting because while the GTX 1650 Super does offer value in a different way, the Arc A380 and RX 6500 XT from AMD and Intel respectively do offer a very base level of ray tracing, and that's an interesting addition to this budget because it means that you have an into those games that require ray tracing. Although these cards really won't run those games very well anyway, you still have the option to play them. Now, these cards are all incredibly low spec. They all have low amounts of VRAM, all have 4 gigs of VRAM, and these cards just aren't very capable, but they do game, and they can game, and they will game. And so this series is me looking at options for my media PC for graphics cards. And the PC is just a lower mid-range PC, a 10,400 Intel i5 chip, 16 gigs of slowish DDR4 RAM, and just a slow NVMe drive, right? So it's an entry level gaming build in that sense, but it's just going to be used for couch gaming, hopefully at 2K. But if you're looking at cards like this, you're not going to be playing at 2K. You're barely going to be playing at HD if you're talking about the newest AAA games. And so let's take a look at how these cards do. First up here, we have Dying Light 2. Now, these cards are tested with a i5 13600K, which is a more recent CPU than the one I have in my PC, but this is more just a comparison between the cards rather than a true look at how they would perform in my system per se. And so Dying Light 2 is a difficult game to run, and this is at HD low settings, no ray tracing, but also no upscaling. At HD, we are looking at 54 FPS average on the 1650 Super. We are looking at 72 average on the Arc A380, and we are looking at 60 average on the 6500 XT. So interestingly, the ray tracing capable cards in the lead here. Then Delta Force, a relatively new game, came out a couple of years ago. We are looking at low settings, of course, HD again. 83 FPS on the NVIDIA 1650 Super, 82 on the Arc A380, and 91 on the RX 6500 XT. So far capable of playing these games, all of these cards, but obviously at low settings. Dying Light the Beast, an expansion, 55 on the 1650, 43 on the A380, and 61 on the RX 6500 XT. Interesting there. Helldivers 2, something that I would want to play as a console equivalent PC. Low settings HD, 67 on the 1650, the A380 does 65, and the RX 6500 XT does 73. So far the 6500 XT somewhat in the lead, doing a bit better than the rest of the games, and the 1% lows are higher as well. The Arc A380 in second place here, and the 1650 by far lowest place. Moving on to Silent Hill F, a very recent game and quite a beautiful game. Low settings, no ray tracing, no upscaling. So it's interesting, of course, that these tests don't use upscaling because you can enable those and they will yield better results, right? So you do have that option, even though it's not going to be supported at a hardware level. You still have options, and you'll be able to push higher settings if you do use upscaling. So the NVIDIA 1650 here is getting an average of 45, the A380 an average of 38. Interestingly, that it's lower. and the 6500 47. None of these particularly playable, but the 1650 and the 6500 XT, you can still make a caveat there and play it at this frame rate if you really have to. Black Ops 6, another relatively recent game. Basic settings, basically low settings. 66 on the 1650, 53 on the Arc, and 71 on the 6500 XT. So the 6500 XT is actually somewhat capable of playing these games. Ghost of Tsushima, we are looking at low settings again, no upscaling, and then 44 on the 1650, 42 on the A380, and 59 on the 6500 XT. It's interesting that the AMD card is actually getting frame rates close to 60 in most of these games, and you're going to play at low settings, but it can play them at respectable frame rates with relatively good frame times as well. Forza Horizon 5, the previous one, we are looking at 68 on the 1650, 77 on the Arc A380, and 79 on the RX 6500 XT. So decent results on all of them, and this is running at HD high settings. So some games you can still play at high settings on HD. Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West, not Zero Dawn. Low settings, 1080p, 43 on the 1650, 38 on the A380, not very playable, and 42 on the 6500. The first one where the NVIDIA card actually wins. Black Myth Wukong, a difficult game to run. We are looking at 35 on the 1650 at low settings. FSR is enabled in this test. A380, 27, not playable. Well, 35 isn't playable either. And 6500 XT is getting 35 as well. So this is the first game where, even at low settings with FSR, not playable. No one wants to play at under 40 FPS, in my opinion. Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced. This will run fine on all of these cards. 92 on the 1650 Super, 64 on the A380, and 76 on the 6500 XT. Again, the NVIDIA card's in the lead in this one, so it's been the fastest twice. Might even be in second place now. Spider-Man Remastered, 87 on the 1650, 88 on the A380, and 90 on the 6500 XT. This is at low settings. I would probably go to medium settings and just play at 60 FPS. Have a bit better looking game. All of the frame times are relatively good, and the 1% lows are relatively good here. So this is going to be a fine experience. Red Dead Redemption 2 will be playable. 69 on the 1650, 63 on the A380, and 76 on the 6500 XT. And so it's interesting how much better the 6500 XT is than these cards so far. Assassin's Creed Mirage, we are looking at 64 on the 1650, 48 on the A380, and 60 on the RX 6500 XT. So again, the NVIDIA is first in this one, and I believe it is firmly in second place now. Another one where the NVIDIA card is beating the rest in FIFA 25, Need for Speed Unbound. We are looking at 70 on the 1650, 68 on the A380, and 70 FPS on the 6500 XT. So games like these, racing games like Need for Speed Unbound or Forza Horizon 5, maybe even 6, you are going to get playable frame rates. And if for someone like myself that will play games like these on a console equivalent setup, I'm happy to see this. Honestly, I'm probably not going to get any of these cards because I want to be able to play at 2K at least medium settings, 60 FPS, so I have to go at least one step up. But for someone that's just getting into PCs, doesn't have a big budget, this might be a very good starting point. Cyberpunk, difficult to run, 62 on the 1650 Super, 61 on the A380, and 59 on the 6500 XT. And I believe that's the first time that the 6500 XT has not been in the lead. But all of these are good results, low settings at 1080p. So if you're happy with not the best looking experience, you can still play a ton of games on this card. Spider-Man 2, something that I haven't played and will want to play. And we are looking at 48 on the 1650, 36 on the A380, and 43 on the 6500 XT. So I probably wouldn't play this on the A380, but you do have the option of enabling XeSS or FSR. And again, this is a new game. It's getting to the point of not playable on these cards, but it still is playable somewhat. Space Marine 2, 62 on the 1650, 31 on the A380, and 63 on the 6500 XT. Interesting to me how the A380 isn't keeping up with the 1650, because in my head the A380 is somewhat valuable because it has ray tracing. But if it's not going to be able to play these games, never mind with ray tracing, and this has FSR quality already at low settings, new games, it's just not going to run well on the A380, unfortunately. Dead Space remake now, and we are looking at 72 on the 1650 Super, 62 on the A380, and 74 on the 6500 XT. Relatively good results on all of those. We'll do one last game here. We'll take a look at an older game, Left 4 Dead 2, something that should run well on all of these cards. And we do get 211 on the 1650, we get 224 on the A380, and we get 234 on the RX 6500 XT. So let's restart the video here and talk about the results. The 6500 XT is comfortably in the lead. It seems to be not just a little bit, but way better than the rest of the cards at especially modern games. Now, the 6500 XT and the A380 do offer a very base level of ray tracing support, but I don't recommend you actually play ray traced games because it's just not, doesn't have enough ray tracing cores in these cards to actually compete with these games. But it's interesting to me how technically it seems like the 1650 got second place instead of the A380, and the 1650 is a weak card. It only has 4 gigs of VRAM. It is older. I believe the A380 might have 6 gigs of VRAM, but I forget whether it was 6 or 4 gigs, so just double check that, because that does add, let's double check that for a second, because that does change the proposition, because if it has 6 gigs of VRAM, yeah, it does. So the A380 has 6 gigs of VRAM, which changes the proposition a bit, because now, even though it doesn't perform as well, you could technically keep everything at low, like let's say something like Red Dead Redemption, right? You could keep everything on low settings, but you could then turn the graphics up to medium or high, the texture quality on the A380, because it has more VRAM, because the RX 6500 has 4 gigs and the 1650 Super has 4 gigs as well. And so that brings a unique value proposition to the A380, because maybe you'll play everything at low, but you can turn up the textures, which makes games look a lot better. So it's interesting in that way. The A380, though, in some games just doesn't have the performance. So if there are games in this list that you want to play that do perform well on it, maybe I'd say go ahead and get it. But there are a lot of games that just don't run well on the Arc series of cards, especially the first gen Arc series of cards, the A series. And so in some cases it makes more sense to get the 1650 Super or the 6500 XT. But here's the thing, I wouldn't recommend the 1650 Super at this point, because it doesn't have any of the new technology. It doesn't have ray tracing. It's not an RTX card. The 6500 XT, though, is the perfect entry point into modern gaming, because it has ray tracing. It has relatively good performance in these games, mostly above 60 FPS, bar maybe Black Myth Wukong. And, you know, it's going to be playable with new games as well. Stuff like Spider-Man 2, as we saw, was semi-playable on the 6500 XT, whereas on the other cards, okay, in this case specifically, the 1650 is actually quite good, but the Arc card just doesn't keep up here. Games like Warhammer, the 1650 again does quite well. So there are some games where the 1650 does prove its worth. But I would go with the 6500 XT just because it has some of the newer technologies. It's got very stable drivers. The 1650s drivers are good as well because it's a very classic card at this point. And it's a very popular card as well. But for me personally, I would go with the 6500 XT. It also, a PC like this would be better suited for a Linux build. And so that makes sense. Like, let's say you're doing a Steam machine, Steam OS build, you know, console equivalent build. I think it makes sense to then go with the AMD card because the driver support works better for Linux builds. So for me, I would go with the RX 6500 XT. The Arc A380 I wouldn't consider just because it performs very poorly in general. It has more VRAM, but that doesn't matter when, you know, most games are unplayable on it. So yes, you can turn up the texture resolutions, but it's, you know, games need to have a baseline of at least 45 FPS for that to even matter, and it just doesn't with that card. If you want to drop even further to 720p, maybe you can consider it, but that's just not something anymore. No one does that. And so I would probably go with the RX 6500 XT. Now let's talk pricing because that's also important. The Arc A380, I'm just going to go on what I see these cards at because I've seen listings for all of them in the last week. And I'm, of course, talking about secondhand because you can't buy these cards new anymore. And so the 1650, I purchased one a while back, a couple of years ago, for 1,500 Rand. That is, let's think about how much that is. That is just under $100. Right now, it's about $92 or something like that. So let's say $90 on that. The Arc A380 is a bit more expensive. I saw one for 2,000 Rand. So that is $130, $135. The RX 6500 XT I've seen for just under 2,000 Rand. So between the 1650 and RX and Arc A380, the RX 6500 XT I've seen for about 1,700 Rand. And so, you know, that's almost exactly $100. It depends on the, you know, the fluctuation of the dollar, but the 1650 is the cheapest. The RX 6500 XT is the middle, and the Arc A380 is the most expensive. So the RX, that's all the more reason why the RX 6500 XT wins for me, because it's the best value in terms of performance. And in terms of price, it's very close to the 1650. Maybe if you go price to performance, the 1650 and the RX 6500 XT would be neck and neck. But I would get it for the extra feature sets that it has and for the Linux build driver support. So that would be my recommendation, is the AMD card. But again, these cards are just a bit too old in 2026. And I would probably go for at least the next step up, but probably even one more step. So the next step up would be a 1660 Super, a Arc A580, I think, or an RX 6600. And those are a bit more expensive. But that's what I would do. So that's going to be about it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.